Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Kaffeepause. Each week, we check in with a journalist based in Germany to talk about the news stories behind the headlines. And today, I am delighted to welcome Erika Solomon. She has been Berlin correspondent for the New York Times since April of 2022. And Erika, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So there is a lot to talk about when it comes to what's going on in Germany right now, but I often like to begin the Kaffeepause by just asking about the politische Stimmung, the political mood in Berlin and in Germany as a whole, because it helps set the stage for the conversation, and it's a great way just to sort of measure the pulse. Um,
Mm.
what can you tell us about the atmosphere at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, if I was a tabloid headline writer, I think my headline for this week would be like politicians behaving badly. Like there's been a lot of uh spats right now. I mean, this has been building up for many, many months in Germany, but over the weekend we had an intense debate within the government coalition about a leak of information in a sort of more secure briefing that was given. And the thing about this that was really contentious was that it was about the Taurus missile deliveries or lack of them. That the chancellor has been adamant that he won't do it, to the point that even his own coalition partners, the Greens and the FDP, don't understand that position and have publicly said, we don't have any information that indicates why this is the case. The chancellor has repeatedly said there is information out there. There was a leak in a German online publication called T-Online, where they explained the sort of security briefing that laid out all the complicated technical reasons why it could expose Germany. Um, and this just kind of outraged the coalition partners partly, and as well as other members of the council. And it's really the backdrop of just sort of a constant bickering that we have been seeing within the coalition, and more broadly, a sort of I don't want to use the word exploitation, but sort of taking advantage of the situation by the largest, most popular party right now in Germany, the Christian Democrats, who who see an opportunity here, you know, with the coalition bickering, and they are picking away where they can. The problem is that in the backdrop of all of this, we have the resurgence of the Alternative for Germany, the far right, and they are doing extremely well. They're the second most popular party in polls. So it's really kind of a painful moment for Germany to be having this type of insider fighting within their government, in general, sort of tensions between the quote unquote democratic parties, the mainstream parties. So yeah, it's sort of there's a bit of a tense mood. I don't think we're at a point yet of any kind of collapse, but you hear more and more talk about the problems within the coalition and how this time it's really getting serious. And so I would say that's sort of the general mood.
I mean, I think that's a really important observation. Obviously, over the weekend and this morning, I was reading, press coverage and listening to the radio a little bit, the German radio, and did hear about this leak from the Bundestag committee about Taurus, and of course, it comes right on the heels of the release of a confidential phone conversation about Taurus between four Bundeswehr officers, senior officers. And so, the whole Taurus debate is so complicated and so complex. And I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that for many people, they don't really understand why Scholz is so adamant
Mm.
about not providing the Taurus. He is, however, sort of describing himself as the Friedenskanzler, right? The peace chancellor. And this has to be, partly because of some of the elections that are on the horizon, thinking about the European elections in June and trying to shore up the Social Democrats in that, thinking about the elections in three Eastern states this fall. Obviously, Germany's election slated for the fall of 2025 is further away, but there are these periodic discussions about whether or not the coalition will hold and there will be new elections. Can you talk a little bit about how this notion of Scholz as a Friedenskanzler or peace chancellor is being received by the public?
Yes, I think this is actually a really interesting point that you picked up on, and also the timing of it, which gets to another subject that I'm sure we'll want to talk about, and that is the arrival of Emmanuel Macron in Berlin last Friday to discuss their plans for supporting Ukraine at this very sensitive moment where US support is kind of lacking. And so what we had over the past week, we had this debate brought by the CDU, again going back to my point about sort of the main loyal opposition bringing up stuff that they know they're not going to get the other parties to agree to, which is delivering Taurus missiles. And so we've had this debate this whole past week with the chancellor in the Bundestag, taking questions from the Christian Democrats and his own government partners about, why he won't do this. And this idea of the Friedenskanzler has come up. And at the same time, the next day, when the Bundestag was actually debating whether or not to pass this motion of the CDU's, we had the head of the parliamentary faction for the SPD, Ralf Mützenich, saying, well, why shouldn't we be talking about freezing this war? Why would we be talking more about making more war instead of trying to end it? And I think this set a lot of alarm bells ringing for people in Germany who are very supportive of Ukraine and who kind of are worried that they're watching a backslide in the Social Democrats towards their sort of traditional position as a very strong pacifist ideology and a sort of affinity for Russia, a relationship with Russia based on Germany's history of trying to, make amends for World War
Mhm.
II. And so when people hear this, that's what they are hearing. That's what they are hearing, regardless of whether that's fair or not from Scholz's point of view or Mutzenich. I think it's fair for his opponents and for other people in Germany who have a vested interest in how this war plays out. That's what they hear. And so it's sort of raised this debate. You see it in the newspapers. We saw the former very controversial Ukrainian ambassador to Germany also raising this issue that this sounds a lot like what you guys were doing before, which in a way they argue is what got us into this position because Germany was very happy to rely on cheap Russian gas. They weren't asking a lot of difficult questions that well, basically only the Green Party at a certain point were trying to pose about what are our interests here? What are we doing? This is maybe not strategically a good idea. And so, yeah, there's a lot of concern as to why we're hearing these words again. I don't think that's really what the chancellor means. I think, relatively speaking, he and his and the chancellor are pretty committed to the course they're taking on the war right now. But I think you could ask the question whether this is playing politics because there is a large portion of Germans who still have a lot of ambivalent feelings about the war. Even if on one level they are supportive of it in principle, there's a lot more reluctance that we're seeing when it comes to more and more weapons deliveries. Scholz has to play a very difficult balancing act here between what I think he and most people on the political scene see as absolutely necessary for Europe's defense, and the fact that you have a German population that is ambivalent about the war, very upset about the living conditions that they're under, a shrinking economy, feeling that the future is not as good for their children, their grandchildren as what they, had to look forward to. And he's trying to walk that line. So I
Mhm.
think that's what's happening here when we hear these words.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, right? It is walking that fine line and trying to be all things to everybody, which obviously is always very difficult. But I think when it comes down to Ukraine, Scholz up to now has been incredibly reluctant to talk about helping Ukraine win. It's been more about seeing a Russian defeat, certainly supporting Ukraine. But I think that there are a lot of people that wonder whether this government will really help Ukraine win and do everything that it needs to do to make that happen. And so that's actually a perfect transition to something that you just touched on. This visit by Emmanuel Macron over the weekend to Germany, and of course also the visit by Donald Tusk from Poland, the prime minister. It was interesting at the Munich Security Conference. I at least thought that Poland and France were sort of conspicuous through their absence and thought that that would have been a good platform or a good opportunity to show strong European unity on Ukraine. I mean, okay, a month later, it's great that Macron came to Paris to Berlin and you covered the visit. And for all intents and purposes, the idea was sort of to patch up some of the differences between Berlin and Paris. And then in addition with Donald Tusk to talk about support for Ukraine. So let's talk about each of these things in turn. Let's start with the bilateral relationship between Paris and Berlin. Were Scholz and Macron able to get things back on track?
I think that what I always hear from people in the chancellery about this subject is like a reluctance. First of all, there's a reluctance in any kind of public sort of platform to acknowledge what we all know is the case, which is that there's a very difficult relationship between Scholz and Macron personally. But what they will say is, actually the situation wasn't that much better between Macron and Merkel before. Like there's always this tension. The important part is that we continue to meet and we continue to negotiate over the differences and so on. And that's what matters, and that's definitely still the case. That's sort of their argument in general. I think what we saw in terms of outcomes from what they announced, so some of the things that they said was that they were going to try and start buying more weapons and munitions for Ukraine on the world market. The key word being world market, because France has been pretty adamant about wanting to make everything European. This is part of their sort of
Right.
European strategy for, Europe leading its own defense and so on. And so that was, I think, a slight concession on the part of Macron. That's been, as I understand from my colleagues in Paris, this has been a sort of gradual process on Macron's part. He's been edging toward this concession, if you will. And then I guess the concession from the Scholz side was supposed to be this, I think, very confusing idea of like a Fähigkeitskoalition or something like that, which was like a capability coalition,
Yeah.
Fähigkeitskoalition for missiles.
Yeah.
And they didn't really answer a lot. They didn't take any questions, actually, which I think is interesting and, a bit troubling, actually. And I think that kind of in some ways says a lot, right? That they don't want to take questions in an uncontrolled setting, because I think that the situation clearly is not resolved. But anyway, let's say for the sake of argument, this has opened up a place to talk about getting more long-range missiles to Ukraine. So in that sense, like, I think we've seen some gradual steps from Scholz and Macron, but I think in general, there's still a problem here with the relationship. And I think that, to me, the proof is in what Macron, he gave this interview, I forget, to a French paper on Sunday, where he basically again made his point about not wanting to back away from taking reserving the right to potentially send troops to Ukraine, saying, all the caveats, I wouldn't do this, unless we felt compelled, we had to do it and so on. But it's clear what the message is, and he's sticking to this idea of strategic ambiguity. I do think he tried to show some understanding for the German position in the last interview. So I do think what we're seeing is a little bit of like, I see your point of view, I hear you, I see you, but not actually wanting to shift on what their position is. So I think that's probably a fair progression for things to take. I mean, that's normal, but I do think that in general, what I'm hearing is a lot of concern about the fact that there just seems to be, still very much sticking to these positions. I mean, and the tone, I would say, as well for Scholz, there was this sort of infamous quote he gave. It was actually at like a school event where when somebody asked him about Taurus missiles, he said, "Because I'm the chancellor, that's why." And this is kind of where we're at right now in the mood. And again, this is troubling. And what you hear a lot is people saying, why are we giving ammunition to Putin, by like showing these differences? Again, back to your question about why Macron didn't show up at Munich and so on. I think that's a problem. And I also think, on the flip side, I don't know that it helps when after these meetings we get chastisement from Donald Tusk or whoever saying
Right.
all of these malicious rumors are untrue about, how we don't get along and so on. But the signs that they are sending, which is what people like me and yourself are there to read, are very much the opposite. And then
Yeah.
I think it's kind of, it's not really fair to the average person of average intelligence to say, why are you asking why we have,
Right.
problems? We don't have problems. Look, here we are with our three-way handshake, when we won't take questions. So I think that there's a problem there in terms of the sort of subtle messages that they're still delivering.
So it's interesting that you say that, because one of our listeners actually just submitted a question asking whether you think that Macron and Scholz might be playing good cop, bad cop in an effort to sort of confuse Putin and keep him off kilter?
Gosh, I would that would be an interesting and potentially that would I mean from their perspective, I think that would be a great reason for it. Um, I've never heard that internally from people. I've mostly just heard frustration about the fact that this is happening or that it's getting out and so on. I unfortunately think that is some real tension and differences. Whether or not that unintentionally helps could be an unexpected or maybe even expected benefit, but I do think that the differences are real.
It probably has more to do with the fact that they just have completely different sort of personal styles and policy
Yeah.
prescriptions, right? I mean, I think Macron and Scholz could not be more different. And so
Yeah.
trying to find that common denominator is challenging. But here too, one sees how sort of these tensions around Scholz, right? Scholz has tensions within his government and within his party, and now also with other world leaders like with Emmanuel Macron. Um, there are a lot of tensions around the chancellor at the moment, and it seems to be very difficult for him to smooth over some of those ruffled feathers. Certainly, that's the case with France.
Yeah.
Um, is there anything sort of on the horizon that we should be looking to when it comes to the Franco-German relationship? And part of the reason why I'm asking about that is because, historically, one has looked to the Franco-German partnership as sort of the engine for European engagement. And that engine has been sputtering. And so if you're thinking about sort of the stability of Europe and the future of Europe, having these tensions between Paris and Berlin is not a good thing, particularly given the kinds of challenges that Europe is facing right now.
hmm Yeah, I think Tusk mentioned that, they're going to hopefully have another meeting in Warsaw soon. So I guess, in terms of marking our calendars, that will be sort of the next place to see, where this goes. I personally am going to be looking at where this sort of Friedenskanzler debate goes. I think that's going to be really important for setting the tone for the relationship with Macron. I think that one thing that's important to keep in mind about Germany that it's easy, we probably think of as Americans when we think of our own context is how much domestic stuff matters to them.
Hmm.
They're not, I mean, a lot of, even within European relationships, which are, of course, very important to Germany, but it is, their politicians are very much driven by their domestic needs. And I think that that's going to be a critical question I will be looking at in terms of trying to assess where this relationship will go with Macron over the coming weeks.
Hmm.
And I think that is really an important test is like how he gets through some of these immediate questions regarding his position and how he's going to position, um, or how he sees himself as trying to position the country on Ukraine.
And it comes back to that balancing act that you talked about before, right? How does Scholz sort of balance his policies, his positions, his actions um, for domestic consumption, but also for international consumption? So I think you're absolutely right. And so, with that, we're kind of back to domestic politics, and we've already talked a little bit about some of the divisions within the coalition, but also within the Social Democratic Party, within the SPD. And those are not new, but they seem to be kind of heating up again. You did talk briefly about Ralf Mützenich, who's the head of the parliamentary faction of the Social Democrats, who actually spoke in Parliament and was talking about this, notion of freezing the conflict. That led to a lot of echoes in the press by others who talked about, how freezing the conflict would actually make things worse and would not help Ukraine and would not help move the continent forward. Um, can you talk a little bit about sort of the re responses to Mützenich and how seriously he's and his position is being taken?
I think it is being taken relatively seriously, let's say in the press. I've seen a lot of comments about it, even from sort of more left-wing media, that are saying like this is not okay, like we can't be hearing these words. I think there's broadly a consensus in Germany that the SPD, but not just the SPD, the Christian Democrats as well under Merkel, like there was too much conciliatory action towards Russia, too much done in sort of immediate economic interest and very little strategic, done for strategic interest.
Mhm.
And so I think that this was not a welcome sort of shift, and or there was a fear that if this was a shift, it was not welcome.
Mhm.
So I think that there's going to be a lot of pushback from a certain part of from the political class. The question, though, is what sort of broader German population thinks. And I think this is a question that I think troublingly we don't have enough information on. One of the things I've been struck by every time I talk to, say, think tankers, there's been a lot of effort over the past year or two by basically since the war in Ukraine, or since the full-scale invasion started, where I saw like these sort of concerted efforts by think tankers to sort of go out into the world, as it will, in Germany and talk to regular people. So not just in Berlin, but go out
Right.
to Leipzig and to all these other cities and sort of be like, here's what we're researching. This is what we found. And what a lot of them tell me is that when they do these events in these other places, far-flung, if you will, places, there's a lot more resistance to the narrative that they have as to what's going on. And so a lot of them have said to me privately that, I'm not really sure that the mood that we talk about in Berlin is really reflective of the mood in Germany. When I'm at a closed door meeting with, businessmen in Baden-Württemberg, I get a very different perspective on the war than, when I'm sitting at a public session,
Sure.
Berlin or elsewhere, or Hamburg or wherever. And so I think there is actually I think, this is what Schultz, by the way, and his people always argue, is that you guys are not paying attention to those people. We are. And so there's
Mhm.
this tension between the people who say, look, there are specific European interests that are German interests about fighting this war. And it's your job to make that message understandable and relatable to people. And then you have Schultz and his people saying, look, I'm trying to interact with the real position among a lot of
Mhm.
Germans, and I have to relate to them. And this is sort of a tension that I think is unresolved. And to me, that's a lot of what's going on in the SPD is sort of like, what leads this? Do we
Right.
react to what Germans feel, or do we, take on this leadership position and try to shape how they feel about it?
And I think that that is one of the real tests facing the party as it moves forward, right? Having lost traction when you look at polling
Yeah.
numbers, the SPD is just not where it was even 2.5 or 3 years ago, and that poses a huge challenge. So sticking with domestic politics, but shifting gears a little bit, Erika, you had a piece last week about the AfD, and you posed a question that has come up a couple times before in the Kaffeepause, and you really sort of led your article with the question. You asked, how far should a democracy go in restricting a party that many believe is bent on undermining it? And I think that this really is one of the key questions that Germany is grappling with as it tries to deal with the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, the AfD, to sort of set limits for it. But as it does that, it almost puts more wind in the sails of the party and it increases its popularity. Can you talk a little bit about some of the efforts that the government is undertaking to try to constrain the AfD and how this debate is playing out?
Yes. So there are a lot of ways in which the government is, and not just the government, like, regular citizens are talking about how they can counter this rising popularity of the AfD. And they take place on many levels. I think that probably most important right now is what's happening in different states. So we
Hmm.
have state parliaments in Germany, not just the federal parliament. And in these parliaments, we have, like in any parliament, there are customs and there are bylaws, how these parliaments are run. And suddenly, just like we had in the United States, a different, whether it's filibustering or so on, where suddenly you see, oh, this tradition is maybe going to be exploited or is being exploited. Um, so you have people like basically asking questions about how they traditionally did things versus whether they should change them. There are also rules that they're talking about changing. So that's sort of one basket. Another basket is whether or not there should be amendments made to the Constitution. This is sort of the big one in terms of it's really hard to do. Once you do it, it's really hard to undo. Um, And the main one that is under discussion right now is whether or not to amend the laws around how you appoint Supreme Court judges in such a way that it, well, from the perspective of mainstream parties to ensure their independence. But it also makes it a lot harder to change those laws if you feel like, oh, maybe the system isn't working, we need to adjust it. If suddenly the AfD really did take on the numbers in the federal parliament, that we're seeing in polls, that can make that work a lot harder in the future. And then the third basket you have are sort of like laws or practices being done by, say, the Interior Ministry. So the Interior Minister has also come out with this 13-point plan, a lot of which many have pointed out are actually old points. But regardless, she's talking about sort of sharpening laws or practices by the police that I think really do raise a lot of questions in terms of, again, this question of how far do you go and could this backfire if we make this the norm? And then I guess there's also the nuclear option. That's the banning of the party. This is seen as like a really, really drastic step. I mean, for democracies generally, not specifically for Germany, to ban a party is basically suppressing, a certain portion of what voters say that they want. And so that's seen as kind of a very drastic step to take. And there are movements as well in that direction. You are seeing different parties talking about trying to take that step. There's a state government or city government, really, Bremen is talking about starting to gather information or evidence to petition either the parliament or the Bundesrat or the government itself to take on the role of petitioning for a ban of the AfD. So these are all the options that are being explored, actively implemented, that we have on the table right now.
And of course, there are also, I guess, some parts of the party that are under observation by the intelligence agencies in Germany as well, right? So there are lots of questions about the party and its activities. So it's very much in the spotlight. What I think is interesting and important to point out as well is that this is not just a phenomenon in the East. In West German states as well, you see some increase in popularity in the role of the AfD. I guess it was in the state of Hessen that it became the largest opposition party.
Same in Bavaria, yeah.
I was going to say this is true in Bavaria as well. And these are not insignificant states, right? This is a nationwide trend and not something that one can just say is relegated to the former East Germany.
Right.
So do you feel, I mean, obviously in the US, we have these debates, conversations about confidence in democratic institutions and practices and sort of waning confidence, waning trust in democratic institutions and practices. Do you see that happening in Germany partly around these debates related to the AfD?
I think for the people, so first of all, one point, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening to this will already know this, but I think it's probably important just to remind ourselves that there have been these like very large protests around the country after a very alarming report by the investigative outlet Correctiv about AfD meeting with other far-right figures and topics coming up like remigration or basically deportation of people, including potentially, debatably citizens who are of an immigrant background. And so when you talk to these people, I think they feel they've been having large protests. These have sort of died down now recently. I think they feel more emboldened by what's going on and indeed like feel that these are all encouraging signs. I think the people who worry about whether or not this could turn the wrong way are people who are like legal experts, a lot of politicians, because they know the way the sausage is made. And I'm not sure that trickles down to the same, level to average people who are coming out on the streets and who kind of really just want to see the government act and show, their lawmakers act and show that they are doing something. But I will say, I mean, just sort of anecdotally, I've been going to far right rallies, obviously for work, since I started covering Germany in 2020, so right around the time of the pandemic. But before that, I was here learning German, and I was in an area where there was a lot of neo-Nazi like rallies. So I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out who these people were and talking to them. And I was struck at that time, this was in like 2018, by how many people told me they were not living in a real democracy. And I had never really heard any Germans say that to me before this point. I'd only ever heard it in these sort of really extreme neo-Nazi groups. Now I feel like that's just the average thing you hear when you talk to, like, when you hear these AfD politicians, when you go to the rallies that they're at. I feel that that sort of argument is growing, and you hear it more regularly, and I see politicians from the AfD tapping into it more frequently
Mhm.
um, in their rhetoric. And so that I find worrying. I think that is a sign that a certain view of democracy is being shifted. And I think, of course, we can't take this out of the broader context, of Hungary, previously Poland, even the United States, these other countries where people are asking questions, are being emboldened to ask questions about, oh, well, I actually don't think this is fair. This system is fair for this or that reason. We can argue about whether or not they're right or not, but the point is that there are a lot of people who are publicly, openly saying that that is how they feel. And I
Mhm.
think that's sort of growing in Germany. So I think that's sort of worrying.
Lots of people who are very disenchanted and feeling disenfranchised with the status quo, and that sort of leads to another, interesting development in Germany over the past few months, the creation of this new party around Sarah Wagenknecht, right? Where you have a politician from the far left who has been sort of appealing to the far right, and with her new party, seems to be wanting to sort of take away from the AfD a little bit and create a new party. How does she fit into this? What's the latest on her party?
Mhm. Zara Wagenknecht is such an interesting figure because, of course, she originally, was a member of the SED, so like
Right.
the East German governing party, and then after that went to Die Linke and has sort of since split off to make her own party. She kind of straddles these lines, and I think it's a representative trend that we're seeing in all of these countries, democracies, where I think the political spectrum and where the lines are, everything is shifting, and everyone's trying to figure out the new order. And so I think I see Wagenknecht's new party as sort of a new stab at figuring out a spot on this spectrum, whatever it is now. Yes, she is traditionally left wing and sort of certain types of social or fiscal policies, but she's taken on the sort of populist right wing tone on migration more and more in the past few years. And I'm watching her party as sort of a question, is like, is the momentum that we're seeing in Germany, the disenchantment, is it far right? Is it really tapped into a certain type of far right feeling, or is it something else, and can other parties tap into it? Or other parts of the political spectrum tap into it? Are the only people who can take advantage of this the far right, or are there other options? And so, like, and does it have to be specifically tied to migration? I think that is a big question as well, because she's not different on that. Um, and so that's sort of like why I think what her role will be very interesting. She has done better, and there's certain polls in East Germany where she's actually taken a dent out of the AfD. I think that, a trend that we see in Germany that I believe is different from the United States is that you often see more people saying they would vote for the AfD than actually do vote. Whereas I think in the US, it's the opposite. People will actually not tell polls that this is what they're thinking of doing, and then they would actually go and vote for Trump or people, who are supportive of Trump in the Republican Party. And so this is different. And so would those people who maybe don't actually, when push comes to shove at the polls, don't want to go for the AfD, would they gravitate towards Wagenknecht? I mean, that's going to be a really interesting
Mhm.
question. That I will have to wait for the East German state elections later this year, and it'll be really interesting to see. And I think that will be some interesting feedback for other parties as well.
I mean, obviously, it's sort of reading tea leaves. First, in the run up to the elections, it's looking at a crystal ball, and then afterwards, it's sort of reading the tea leaves of the election. I agree with you completely that in polls, certainly in Germany, people tend to voice their protest and dissatisfaction. The question is then, what are they going to do when they actually show up on election day, and they are in their you know Wahlkabine casting their ballot? It could be very different, but this gives me some concern about the European elections because I feel like what's turnout going to be like? And B, since a lot of people feel that the EU is very far away and that these elections don't really matter, they might use these elections to sort of verbalize that protest as well and possibly vote for right-wing parties. I mean, I'm anticipating a shift to the right across Europe this summer in the European elections.
That's
And
definitely happening in Germany, and there's a mobilization effort happening from the other parties being like, you have to go vote because otherwise, exactly
yeah,
what you're saying is going
yeah.
to happen.
And so I think, so I feel like that's the first, thing to be watching and looking out for. And then the second one, of course, is the three state elections in the East. I mean, we have, and you touched on this, following the report by Correctiv about this secret meeting outside of Potsdam in November of last year. Um, there have been massive demonstrations against the AfD, and we've actually seen the AfD go down in some polling numbers in terms of its popularity from its highs last year. Um, but for me, it's sort of an open question of where did these people go, and do they exercise their vote? So in this regard, there's an awful lot to watch when it comes to German politics. But while we're talking about elections and sort of confidence in elections, the other sort of big news story over the weekend was a so-called election in Russia. And I think everybody, knew what the results of the process was going to be before the process even started. But I don't so much want to talk to you about sort of the election itself and the results of the election, but rather how Germany has responded to it. The EU came out saying that the election was not free or fair, particularly because no international observers were allowed to come and watch the election. Baerbock, meeting with her foreign minister colleagues, said it was an election without an election. Um, and in one of the reports that I heard, both the chancellery and the president's office said that neither Scholz or Steinmeier were planning on congratulating Putin on his reelection. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how Berlin, how Germany is responding to what happened in Russia over the weekend and another term for Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think all the points you raise are sort of the main, they've been the main topics that you will see in Germany. One thing that I would just add is that there was a lot of talk about the vote in Berlin. So of course, the Russian vote, that you can go to the embassy and you can vote. And of course, there was this call by the opposition from Navalny from before his death, go at noon on Sunday to the polls to register your protest. His wife was here in Berlin doing just that. The opposition has pushed forward with this call, or did push forward with this call. And so we saw some of that happening in Berlin as well, most symbolically with Navalny's wife. And there was like a lot of talk. This is sort of like a funny anecdote of that. There was a lot of talk because, of course, the Russian embassy like put out videos and stuff of people coming to vote here, and just ignoring this whole trend. But also they did like a video of the ambassador with his wife going to vote, and she was wearing this shawl, and everyone in German media was commenting on the fact that the shawl looked like it was blue and yellow, and everyone's like, oh, is this like a message? What's the message? So on. And then it got to the point that actually the Russian embassy like put out like an anti-fake news like expose where they like showed another angle of the ambassador and his wife, where you can see the scarf is actually many different colors, and they were like arguing, oh, see, like they're the fake news. I have no idea if the video that was making the rounds in Germany was altered or if it was just the angle of the
Right.
camera. But anyway, it was just sort of like a funny moment where like you saw like the Russian sort of poking at what they know is often said about their media as being fake news and so on, and sort of ribbing Germans, which they really love to do. Um, and at the same time, yeah, I think the other thing I would just add to what you were talking about, the mood, and actually, unfortunately, this is going to go back to my point about domestic politics, is that a lot of people also pointed out how chilling they found it that just a few days after this Mützenich comment about the Friedenskanzler and the freezing of the peace in Parliament, we see Navalny's wife like, out here doing this brave protest vote and so on. And like, how can this be both of these things be happening in the capital of Berlin right now? And so a lot of I saw a lot of comments about that as well, and just sort of feeling that, you know, what are we doing? What is our position here? Why are we reopening these sort of chapters we thought we were closed? So yeah, I think that's sort of been in general the mood. But I don't think there's anybody, with the exception of the AfD, who has been treating these elections as anything but a window dressing. There was a sort of attempt by some members of parliament in Bavaria. They wanted to go and observe the elections, and the party itself in Berlin said, no, don't do that, or not with our money anyway.
Mhm.
It'll be interesting to see how much Russian media over the next few days highlights if and how many AfD members did show up. They're often used in sort of like Russian or Belarusian state media at elections to be like, look, we have Western lawmakers who are here observing our independent elections. So, it'll be interesting to see if we see some of that again in the next coming days.
Well, and I think your point is a really good one about sort of looking at how both the narrative on Ukraine and the narrative on Russia are really being divisive in Germany and sort of creating some real tensions among the political elite, but of course also the general public as well. Um, as we sort of come to a close here, I guess, we have talked about a lot of different things, and we've circled back to a couple of different topics a few times as well. Without giving up any scoops that you might be working on, sort of what are the other stories that you're following that you think people should really pay attention to, even some of them that are kind of a little bit more under the radar, or who to watch?
Yeah. Oh, these are all really great questions. So it's funny you ask this because I've been asking myself one of the questions. I'll explain in a second. But as for what I'm working on, I don't think it's like a particular scoop. So I can tell you the next thing I'm working on is because it taps on a lot of things we've talked about today, is about the German Bundestag and how much they're exposed to espionage or not, and just general influence from Russia. There was this case earlier this month, or maybe last month, excuse me, where Russian and German media exposed an aide of an AfD
Yeah.
Bundestag member who had links to the FSB. I can't tell you how many times when I actually wrote a piece last year about all the Bundestag members whose offices are facing the Russian embassy and how weird they feel about that, and like they've actually been warned that they could be spied on and so on. And so I kind of went back to some of those people and as well to other members to talk to them about like, how much are you worried about employees inside the Bundestag, AfD members? And it's really interesting just how worried people are, and for different reasons. I spoke to one member of one of the governing parties who gave me a list of people who work for his own colleagues that he's just uncomfortable with. And I spoke to another Bundestag member who is really just worried about the AfD and is like, why does any of this even matter when our own people, our own democratically elected people are sitting in on these very important,
Mhm.
somewhat private sessions? And, on and on and on. So it's like this open question, and I think it sort of gets at some of the real good in the way German democracy works that's maybe being exploited. They have this program where people from anywhere around the world can intern at the Bundestag, which is a lovely idea, and I think kind of sort of trying to allow people to be exposed to they have nothing to hide, transparent, come and see how our democracy runs. But on the other hand, that could easily be exploited, and now they're kind of uncomfortable with telling us, do they have a screening process for these people? Do they not? And so, there's like the questions that I think democracies now have to ask themselves is like,
Yeah.
hey, we want to be open, but also, are we putting ourselves at risk, and how do we deal with that? So that's sort of the next thing I'm working on. As for
Fascinating.
people to look at, I was having this debate with myself today as to whether or not it was time to return to this Austrian far-right figure, Martin Sellner,
Mhm.
who I think, as journalists, we have to be really careful about not providing a platform for extremist figures. But on the other hand, sometimes, they just come up enough that you start thinking, well, I also can't deny what is going on. And Martin Sellner has been at the heart of like a lot of the subjects that we've been talking about today. He was the one who gave the spiel about the remigration topic at this
Hmm.
very, much discussed meeting in Potsdam. He was this weekend, I believe, banned from giving a talk in Switzerland and was briefly detained by Swiss authorities because they're trying to see if they could basically block him from entering the country. It got Elon Musk's attention. So this guy, he wrote this book about remigration, and he's kind of trying to peddle his plans. And the reason why I think it's really something we do have to pay attention to is because it has made it now into mainstream
Hmm.
conversations. The fact of the matter is, in a lot of matters when it comes to the immigration question and how you deal with integration and all these things, there are still one thing that the AfD fairly points out that is not often discussed is that Potsdam meeting, there were almost as many CDU members there as AfD.
Yeah.
And so, there is a real question here as to how much far right extremist figures have sort of dragged parts of the mainstream with them for reasons of trying to maintain voters and and so on. And so like I think I'm starting to ask myself a question about whether or not I need to write about this guy and how I would do it and so on. He's obviously been in the news before. He's not like a secret figure,
Hmm.
but I do think he's sort of creating more relevance for himself again in sort of right-wing circles.
And so in that sense, certainly somebody to watch because he has a following, and certainly coming off of the Potsdam meeting, there was a huge increased awareness in him and some of his ideas. But if his ideas are resonating with people, it's probably important, really important to know what those ideas are and how he's going about, sharing them. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like definitely somebody for us to keep an eye on top of everything else that we just are following.
Yeah.
Well, Erika, this has been fantastic. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a very fast-paced and wide-ranging conversation. We covered a lot, but then you have a lot on your plate on any given day. So thank you for sharing that with us, and we hope to have you back again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.